The midday sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the minimalist estate, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows across the marble island. Imani didn't look up as she sliced a perfectly seared, dry-aged Wagyu steak into thin, buttery strips for her son, Cairo. The aroma of rosemary and sea salt filled the air, the scent of a life lived in the upper echelons of American comfort. Cairo sat tall, his silk shirt gleaming, his plate a masterpiece of culinary indulgence. Then there was Sani. The small, quiet boy sat on a weathered wooden stool in the far corner of the bright kitchen, away from the marble, away from the warmth. Before him lay a chipped plastic container holding 2 cold chicken wings and a scoop of hardened rice from the night before. No silver fork, no linen napkin. "Eat, Sani," Imani whispered, her voice devoid of its usual melody, her back turned to the child. Cairo looked at the orphan, then at his mother, a smirk of entitlement tugging at his lips. He didn't see the way Imani's grip tightened on the steak knife until her knuckles turned white. He didn't see the single, silent tear that hit the cutting board. To the world, this was an act of cruelty. To Imani, it was a desperate daily prayer for the boy's invisibility. Set against the breathtaking backdrop of the California coastline, where the Pacific Ocean meets the jagged cliffs in a spray of white foam, the lives of the Afro-Korean elite moved with a silent, calculated grace. Imani, a woman of dual heritage and singular secrets, had spent a decade building a fortress of normalcy. Her home was a sanctuary of light and glass, yet within its walls, a shadow play was being performed. Cairo, her biological son, was being raised as a prince, draped in the finest fabrics and fed the finest meats. Sani, the orphan she had taken in years ago under mysterious circumstances, was treated as a ghost, a background character in his own life, fed the scraps of a family he wasn't allowed to truly join. This wasn't a story of a wicked stepmother, but a high-stakes game of emotional chess. In a world where the powerful Park Joon-seok, a young man whose wealth was as vast as the ink etched into his skin, was searching for a lost lineage, being a favorite was a death sentence. To be loved was to be a target. To be fed leftovers was to be forgotten by the enemies watching through long-range lenses. But the silence was about to be broken. A long-dormant legal file, held by a judge who knew the truth of a blood pact made in Seoul 20 years prior, was sitting on a mahogany desk, waiting for a single signature to change the gravity of their world. The sun was at its zenith, the highest point of the day, and in the brilliance of that light, the shadows had nowhere left to hide. "Hello, friend, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments so I can know the part of the world you are watching from. And also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you won't miss out on new videos. Now let's go deep into the story." The midday sun in Carmel by the Sea was an intrusive, brilliant force. It poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the kitchen, illuminating every speck of dust and the polished grain of the rift-sawn oak cabinetry. Imani stood at the center of this golden stage, her movements precise, almost robotic. Her heritage, a beautiful, seamless blend of Afro-Korean features, was etched with a weariness that the expensive lighting of her home couldn't mask. On the marble island sat a cast-iron skillet, still sizzling. She plated a thick cut of Wagyu steak, the marbling rendered into a glistening glaze, paired with microgreens and a reduction that smelled of red wine and elderberry. "Cairo, sit," she said softly. Her biological son, Cairo, slid into the high-backed velvet chair. At 17, he carried the effortless arrogance of a boy who had never known a cold room or an empty stomach. He adjusted his designer watch, the metal catching the sunlight, and began to eat. He didn't say thank you. In this house, excellence and luxury were treated as birthrights. Imani watched him for a heartbeat, her expression unreadable, before she turned toward the shadows of the breakfast nook. "Sani, your turn." Sani, a boy of 14 with watchful, amber eyes and a quietness that felt heavier than lead, stepped forward. He didn't approach the marble island. He knew better. He walked to a small, weathered wooden stool tucked near the pantry. Imani reached into the refrigerator and pulled out a translucent plastic container. Inside were 2 cold, charred chicken wings and a small mound of rice that had clumped together from the previous night's dinner. She set it before him without a plate, without a garnish, and without a word. The contrast was staggering. The air in the room seemed to split into two different climates. On one side, the succulent heat of the steak, on the other, the refrigerated chill of the leftovers. Cairo glanced over, a smirk playing on his lips as he saw the orphan struggle with a plastic fork that threatened to snap against the cold rice. "Mother, why do we even keep him here if he's just going to eat the scraps?" Cairo asked, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "It ruins the aesthetic of the house." Imani's hand, which had been reaching for a dish towel, froze midair. She didn't look at Cairo. Instead, her gaze flickered toward the window, toward the long, winding driveway that led to the Pacific Coast Highway. She wasn't looking at the view. She was scanning for black sedans. "Eat your food, Cairo," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp as a blade. "And Sanny, make sure you finish every grain. Do not leave the kitchen until the container is empty. You must look like a boy who is barely getting by. Do you understand?" Sanny looked up. There was no anger in his eyes, only a haunting, deep-seated intelligence. He nodded once and began to chew the cold, rubbery meat. He didn't complain. He had lived in this house for 5 years, and for 5 years he had been the ghost at the feast. He didn't know why Imani treated him like a burden, but he felt the way her eyes lingered on his neck whenever he moved, as if she were looking for a mark that wasn't there yet. Outside, the wind rustled the cypress trees, and for a moment, the beauty of the California day felt like a gilded cage. Imani leaned against the counter, her back to both boys, her eyes closed tight. She was counting the seconds until the sun moved, praying that the light wouldn't reveal the secret she had buried beneath the floorboards of her heart. By 2 in the afternoon, the heat had mellowed into a soft, honeyed glow. The estate's garden was a masterpiece of horticultural design, a fusion of Korean rock gardens and lush, African-inspired flora. Sanny was knelt in the dirt, his hands stained with soil as he pulled weeds from the base of a towering hibiscus. This was his duty. While Cairo spent his afternoons in the air-conditioned gym or playing high-stakes video games, Sanny was kept outdoors, visible to any passerby as the help. Imani watched him from the balcony, a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand. She watched the way Sanny worked with a methodical, rhythmic grace. He was beautiful, in a way that terrified her. As he grew older, his features were beginning to sharpen, losing the soft roundness of childhood and taking on a regal, dangerous clarity. He looked less like an orphan every day and more like the man Imani had been running from for nearly 2 decades. Suddenly, the silence of the afternoon was punctured by the low, guttural hum of a high-performance engine. A matte black SUV slowed at the gate of the estate. It didn't honk. It didn't attempt to enter. It simply sat there, its tinted windows reflecting the bright coastal sun like 2 obsidian eyes. Sanny stopped weeding. He wiped his forehead with the back of a dirty hand, looking toward the gate. Imani's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She set her glass down and hurried toward the stairs, her voice a frantic whisper. "Sanny, get down, move to the shade." But it was too late. The rear window of the SUV rolled down just a few inches. From her vantage point, Imani saw him, Park Jun-seok. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps in his late 20s, but his presence commanded the very air around the vehicle. He wore a crisp, white linen shirt, unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the intricate, dark ink of a tiger's tail winding up his throat. His tattoos were not the chaotic markings of a street brawler. They were the refined, expensive art of a man who owned the shadows he walked in. Jun-seok's gaze didn't land on the magnificent house. It didn't land on Imani, who was now standing frozen on the porch. His eyes locked onto Sanny. He held a small, silver object in his hand, a locket, or perhaps a signet ring, that caught the sun and sent a blinding flash of light directly into the garden. The boy squinted, shielded his eyes, and for a fleeting second the two of them, the tattooed titan and the neglected orphan, shared a silent, cosmic recognition. "Imani," a voice called out. It wasn't Jun-seok, it was one of his associates, standing outside the car now, holding a formal, heavy envelope. "The chairman sends his regards. He heard you were raising a ward in such modest conditions. He finds it curious that a woman of your means would serve leftovers to a guest of such importance." The man walked to the gate and slotted the envelope into the mailbox. He didn't wait for a response. He climbed back into the car, and with a puff of exhaust, The SUV vanished back toward the highway. Imani rushed down the steps, her silk dress catching on a rose bush, tearing the hem. She reached Sani and grabbed him by the shoulders, her fingers digging into his thin frame. "Did he see your face?" she hissed, her eyes darting toward the gate. "Sani, did you look at him?" "He was just a man, Auntie," Sani said, his voice calm, far too calm for a boy his age. "But he looked like he was looking at a ghost. Why did he look at me like I was already dead?" Imani pulled him into a crushing embrace, the smell of dirt and sweat filling her senses. She looked at her beautiful, sunlit home and realized the walls were becoming transparent. The file she had feared for years was no longer a myth. It was coming, and when it arrived, the steak and the leftovers wouldn't matter anymore. Only the blood in their veins would. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the white stucco of the villa in hues of apricot and bruised gold. Inside, the house was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer. Imani sat in her private study, a room bathed in natural light but thick with the scent of old paper and dried jasmine. She held a small, weathered photograph in her hands, a relic from a life lived across the sea and soul. In the photo, a younger Imani stood beside a radiant woman with high cheekbones and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 years. That woman was Sani's mother, and the debt Imani owed her was written in blood and silence. A flashback often haunted her in these quiet hours, the memory of a sun-drenched courtyard in a hidden corner of Gyeonggi-do. The air had been thick with the scent of pine needles and the distant sound of a temple bell. Imani's friend, gasping for breath against a terminal illness, had clutched her hand. "Hide him, Imani. If they see his greatness, they will extinguish it. If he is a prince, they will hunt him. If he is a beggar, they will let him live." The leftovers weren't a punishment. They were a costume. Imani had spent years meticulously crafting a narrative of neglect. She knew that the eyes of the Park family, the conglomerate-turned-empire now led by the tattooed Junseok, were always searching. They were looking for a boy who stood tall, a boy who was fed the finest grains, a boy who carried himself like the heir to a throne that spanned 2 continents. By feeding Sani scraps, by making him work the gardens until his fingernails were stained with the earth of California, she was burying his royal lineage under a layer of common dust. She looked out the window at Sani, who was now sitting on the porch steps, staring at the horizon. He was 14, and the disguise was failing. His posture was naturally straight. His silence was not that of a broken child, but of a stoic observer. Every time she gave Caro a steak and Sani a cold wing, her heart fractured a little more. She saw the confusion in Sani's eyes, the quiet hurt of a boy who wondered what he had done to deserve the secondary status. "Forgive me, my little star," she whispered to the empty room, her voice cracking. "I am making you a ghost so that you do not become a memory." She opened a hidden compartment in her desk and pulled out a matching silver locket. The twin to the one Junseok had flashed in the driveway. It contained no photo, only a microchip and a lock of dark hair. This was the debt. The Park family believed the lineage had ended in that sole courtyard, but the arrival of the black SUV proved that the shadows had long memories. The mystery wasn't in who Sani was. Imani knew that. It was in how much Junseok truly suspected. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, spindly shadows across her desk, Imani realized that the time for scraps was coming to an end. The boy was outgrowing his cage. The following morning was deceptively beautiful. The Pacific mist had cleared by 10, leaving the sky a piercing, vibrant blue. The doorbell rang, a melodic, chinned sound that felt out of place given the tension in Imani's chest. She smoothed her linen trousers and opened the door to find Park Junseok standing on the threshold. He didn't look like a threat. In the bright morning light, he looked like a visionary. He wore a tailored cream blazer, and the tattoos on his neck, vines and ancient script, seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Behind him, the California coast sparkled, but his focus was entirely on the interior of the house. "May I come in, Imani?" he asked. His voice was smooth, like river stones worn down by centuries of water. "It has been a long time since our families shared a meal." Imani stepped aside, her breath hitching. "This is a private home, Junseok. We don't have much to offer a man of your stature." Junseok walked into the living room, his presence filling the high-ceilinged space. He stopped at the dining table, where a single, stained plastic container sat, Sanny's breakfast remnants. He touched the edge of the plastic with a manicured finger, a look of profound sorrow crossing his face. "A child of the sun should not be eating from the dark," Junseok said, turning to face her. "I saw him in the garden yesterday. He has his father's eyes, and his mother's chin. Why do you hide him in the dirt, Imani? Is the air of the heights too thin for him?" At that moment, Sanny entered the room, carrying a basket of fresh lemons from the garden. He stopped, seeing the stranger. The two looked at each other, the wealthy man with the ink of history on his skin, and the boy with the dirt of the present on his hands. "Who are you?" Sanny asked, his voice steady. Junseok smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I am a man who remembers what others choose to forget, Sanny. I am a man who knows that a diamond, even when covered in mud, is still a diamond." He turned back to Imani, his expression hardening. "The judge in San Francisco has the file, Imani. He has been holding it since the day the sun went dark in Seoul. He is calling for a hearing tomorrow. He wants to see the boy, not the orphan, the heir." Imani felt the floor tilt beneath her. The secret was no longer hers to keep. The neglect had been a shield, but Junseok had brought a sword of truth. "He is just a boy," Imani pleaded, her voice a desperate whisper. "No," Junseok replied, stepping closer until he could smell the jasmine on her skin. "He is the reason I have spent 10 years building an empire I do not own. He is the master of my ink and the owner of your house. We will see you at the courthouse at noon. Bring him, and Imani. Dress him in something that reflects his soul, not your fear." Junseok exited as quietly as he had arrived, leaving the scent of expensive sandalwood and the weight of a looming revolution in the air. Sanny dropped the basket of lemons, the bright yellow fruit rolling across the hardwood floor like fallen stars. The afternoon sun hung suspended like a golden coin over the Pacific, casting long, dramatic shadows through the clear-story windows of the estate's private library. This room, filled with first editions and ancestral artifacts, was Cairo's sanctuary, a place where he usually felt like the undisputed heir of the household. But today, the air felt thin, vibrating with the aftershocks of Junseok's visit. Cairo stood by a mahogany bookshelf, his fingers tracing the spine of a leather-bound volume, but his eyes were fixed on his mother, who was frantically packing the Persian rug below. "Mother, you're trembling," Cairo said, his voice a mixture of confusion and burgeoning resentment. "Who was that man? And why did he look at Sanny as if he were a king returned from exile?" Imani didn't answer immediately. She stopped at a hidden wall panel behind a portrait of her own grandmother, a woman who had bridged the gap between Seoul and the American South. With a shaky click, the panel popped open to reveal a heavy, iron-bound ledger. This was the ledger of blood and ink, a record of every cent spent, every sacrifice made, and every secret kept since Sanny had been brought to these shores in the middle of a rain-slicked night. Cairo stepped down from the library ladder, his youthful face hardening. He snatched the ledger before Imani could pull it to her chest. Is this why he eats the scraps while I eat the steak? Is this why you make him scrub the floors while I study at the academy?" He flipped through the pages. His eyes widened as he saw columns of numbers, millions of dollars held in trust, land deeds in Jeju, and corporate shares in San Francisco, all listed under a name he had never heard, Sanny O. James. But beside those riches were the notes in his mother's frantic handwriting. To protect the life, one must starve the ego. To hide the gold, one must wrap it in iron. If Sanny appears loved, he will be killed. Cairo must be the target. Cairo must be the distraction. The realization hit Cairo like a physical blow. The lavish meals, the designer clothes, the constant praise. It hadn't been because he was the favorite. He was the decoy. He was the brightly colored bird meant to draw the predator's eye away from the true prize hiding in the tall grass. His mother had loved him, yes, but she had used his life as a human shield to protect the boy in the corner. "You used me," Cairo whispered, the ledger slipping from his hands and hitting the floor with a thud that echoed through the quiet house. "You let me grow arrogant and cruel to Sanny just so the world would think he was nothing." Imani reached out for him, her eyes brimming with tears that finally spilled over. "I had to make it believable, Cairo. If I had treated you both equally, they would have looked closer at both of you. I needed one son to be the sun so the other could live in the shade where it was safe. Junseok is not just a businessman. He is the enforcer of a legacy that has already claimed Sanny's parents. I couldn't let it claim him too. The beauty of the room, the sunlight, the wealth, the status, suddenly felt hollow to Cairo. He looked out the window at Sanny, who was still sitting on the porch, unaware that his entire life of neglect had been a calculated masterpiece of survival. The mystery was no longer about why Sanny was treated poorly. It was about the staggering weight of the crown he didn't know he wore. The following morning arrived with a clarity that felt surgical. The fog had been burned away by a relentless white sun, revealing the sharp lines of the San Francisco skyline as Imani's car crossed the bridge. In the backseat, Sanny sat in a transformation that felt like a silent earthquake. Gone were the stained t-shirts and the dirt-caked sneakers. At Imani's insistence, he wore a suit of midnight blue silk, his hair brushed back to reveal a forehead that bore the unmistakable mark of nobility. He looked less like a boy, and more like a young man stepping out of a legend. "Auntie," Sanny said, his voice low as they pulled up to the grand, neoclassical courthouse. The building was a monument of white marble and soaring columns, glowing under the noon sun. "Why are we here? And why did you give me the steak this morning? Why did Cairo give me his seat at the table?" Imani adjusted his tie, her hands finally still for the first time in years. "Because the sun is at its highest point, Sanny. There are no more shadows for us to hide in. Today, you stop being my burden and start being my pride." They walked through the high bronze doors, their footsteps echoing on the polished stone floors. The courthouse was filled with natural light, streaming through stained glass domes that depicted the scales of justice. Waiting for them at the end of the long hallway was Park Junseok. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his tattooed neck held high. Beside him stood a phalanx of legal counsel, but their eyes weren't on the documents, they were on the boy. They were ushered into the private chambers of Judge Elias Thorne, a man whose reputation for integrity was as solid as the oak desk he sat behind. The room was breathtaking, walls lined with law books that smelled of old leather and wisdom, with a massive window overlooking the bay. On the desk sat a single, thick file bound in red ribbon. "Imani," the judge said, his voice gravelly but kind. "You have lived a lie for 14 years. You have endured the whispers of your neighbors and the judgment of your own community. You fed this boy the leftovers of your life so that he could one day inherit the feast." The judge turned to Sanny, who stood trembling slightly in his fine clothes. "Young man, do you know why your mother, your guardian, treated you as she did?" Sanny looked at Imani, then at the file on the desk. "I thought I wasn't wanted," he whispered. "No," the judge said, breaking the seal on the file with a crisp, final snap. "You were so wanted that a war was fought to keep you. This file contains the final will of the O. James estate. It was stipulated that you must be raised in perceived hardship until your 14th year to ensure you grew with a heart for the people, and to keep you invisible from the corporate rivals who took your parents' lives. Imani didn't starve you, Sanny. She saved you." The judge began to read the first page aloud. As the words filled the room, detailing billions in assets, land titles, and a blood-bound protection pact, the weight of the leftovers finally lifted. Sanny's eyes filled with tears, not of grief, but of a profound, soul-shaking realization. Every cold wing, every hour in the garden, every moment of being lesser had been a brick in a fortress built by a woman who loved him more than her own reputation. The air in the judge's chambers was thick with the scent of old wood and the electric charge of a life-altering moment. Outside the massive windows, the San Francisco sun struck the glass of neighboring skyscrapers, refracting light into the room like scattered diamonds. Judge Thorne didn't rush. He handled the documents within the red-ribboned file with a reverence usually reserved for ancient scripture. Sanny stood at the center of the room, his midnight blue suit catching the light. To his left stood Imani, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face a mask of exhausted relief. To his right, Park Junseok watched with an intensity that felt like a vigil. "This file," the judge began, his voice resonant in the quiet chamber, "is the Gilded Shield Protocol. It was established 20 years ago by your late father, Sani, and your mother's closest confidant, Imani. It was a legal and social contract designed to solve a singular problem. How do you protect a prince in a world of assassins? The judge turned a page, the paper crisp and loud. The records show that the O. James fortune was being circled by a board of directors that viewed a child heir as a nuisance to be removed. To protect you, Imani agreed to a life of public scrutiny and private heartache. The protocol demanded that you be raised in a state of visible lack. You had to be the child who ate the leftovers. You had to be the child who worked the soil. If a single investigator from the Seoul branch had seen you eating Wagyu steak or wearing designer labels, the connection to the O. James estate would have been solidified, and your life would have been forfeit. Sani's breath hitched. He looked at Imani, whose eyes were closed, her head bowed as if she were finally laying down a heavy cross. The leftovers, Sani, the judge continued, were a legal requirement. Every meal was logged. Every hour you spent in the garden was documented as labor to maintain the persona of a ward being worked for his keep. Imani accepted the role of the cold guardian to ensure that when you reached this age, you would not only be alive, but you would be a man who understood the value of what is earned, not just what is given. Junseok stepped forward, the tattoos on his hands visible as he rested them on the back of a chair. I am the executor of the physical assets, Sani. For 10 years, I have managed the Parco conglomerates under the guise of a usurper. I let the world believe I had taken what was yours so that no one would go looking for you in a small California town. My wealth, my ink, my reputation as a mafia figure. It was all a coat of armor I wore to protect your seat at the table. Sani looked from the judge to the file, his mind racing through years of memories. The cold rice, the chipped plastic containers, the way Imani would sometimes look at him with a gaze so fierce it felt like a flame, only to turn away and treat him like a stranger a moment later. It wasn't hatred. It was the highest form of discipline, an emotional restraint that required Imani to break her own heart every single day to keep his beating. The file is now fully unsealed, Judge Thorne declared, stamping the final page with a gold leaf seal. Sani O. James, you are the legal owner of the Carmel estate, the Seoul holdings, and the trust that has been growing in silence for 14 years. You are no longer an orphan eating scraps. You are the architect of your own future. The transition from the courthouse back to the estate felt like walking from a black and white film into a world of technicolor. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, turning the Pacific into a sheet of hammered gold. But as the car pulled into the driveway, the atmosphere of the house had fundamentally shifted. The leftovers were gone. In the bright, airy kitchen, the small wooden stool in the corner had been removed. In its place stood a chair that matched the rest of the set, a seat at the head of the table. Cairo was there, waiting. He didn't look at Sani with the smirk of a superior anymore. Instead, he stood with a quiet respect, holding a heavy, silver-plated tray. I didn't know, Sani, Cairo said, his voice sincere. I thought I was the light of this house. I didn't realize I was just the shadow meant to hide the sun. Imani walked to the center of the kitchen. She didn't reach for a plastic container. She reached for Sani's hand. For the first time in his memory, she didn't pull away. She didn't look over her shoulder for black SUVs. She pulled him into a hug that smelled of jasmine and home, a hug that lasted long enough to wash away 5 years of cold meals. Tonight, Imani whispered, we eat together, no secrets, no roles, just family. The dinner that followed was a masterpiece of their dual heritage. There was galbi, the short ribs marinated in a rich, sweet pear sauce, and slow-cooked collard greens seasoned with smoked salt. There was jollof rice that glowed red in the evening light and kimchi that had been aged to perfection. Sani sat at the center, the light from the sunset illuminating his face. Junseok joined them, sitting at the far end of the table. He had removed his blazer, revealing the full extent of the tattoos on his arms, stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and the protection of a bloodline. He didn't speak of business or billions. He spoke of Sani's father, of the bravery it took to let a child go so that he might survive. As the meal progressed, the mystery that had defined their lives dissolved into a profound sense of achievement. They had won. The enemies who had been hunting for a prince had been fooled by a pauper, And by the time they realized their mistake, the pauper had become a man with the law and an empire behind him. Sanny picked up his silver fork, looking at the feast laid out before him. He realized that the steak didn't taste better than the leftovers because it was expensive. It tasted better because it was eaten in the light. He looked at Amani, who was finally smiling, the lines of worry around her eyes softened by the candlelight. "Thank you, Mother," Sanny said. It was the first time he had ever called her that. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or cold. It was a bridge. 1 year later. The scene is the same beautiful estate in Carmel, but the energy has been transformed. The rose garden is in full bloom, but the fences have been lowered. Sanny is no longer weeding the soil. He is walking through the garden with a group of young scholars, discussing the foundation he has started for children who, like him, were forced into the shadows by circumstances beyond their control. Cairo sits on the porch, sketching the coastline. He has found his own path, no longer burdened by the need to be a distraction. He and Sanny are closer than brothers, bonded by a secret that nearly broke them, but ultimately forged them into something stronger. Amani stands by the window, watching them both. She no longer looks for black SUVs. She looks at the horizon and sees only the beauty of the day. Park Joon-seok is a frequent guest, no longer a shadow in a vehicle, but a mentor and a friend. The story that began with a plate of leftovers ends with a legacy of abundance. The mystery is solved, the debt is paid, and the table is finally, truly, full.